Hey everyone. Thanks so much for being here. So I'm Ariel Fogel. I do AI security research at Pillar Security, and with me is Evgeny uh, Kokyukin. Forgive me if I'm butchering your name, who runs Hivetrace. So along with Rock Lambros, we co-led version 2 of the OWASP State of Agentic AI Security and Governance report, which is what we're going to walk you through today.
Thanks, Ariel. Before we jump in, I wanted to ask you, actually, what was the most interesting insight for you while working on the report?
I have to say, it was the breadth of the coverage. The report looks at agentic AI security from so many different angles, and so expanding the view of the problem felt really important.
I do agree, and hopefully, readers will find something new and useful for their practice and their work as well. For me, one of the strongest insight came from the survey, a little survey we ran on the notable agentic projects. And the development velocity we saw, the amount of PRs open and close is just mind blowing.
Um, yeah, cool. So before we get into the slides, we wanted to share what surprised us as we were writing this. Honestly, the surprises ended up being reflected in the report. So first, how fast it stopped being theory. When we shipped V1 of the report last summer, most of what we wrote was about lab demos. By the time that we sat down for V2, we had a pile of actual production incidents, CVEs, supply chain attacks, and examples of data leaving systems that they shouldn't have. The pace of adoption and incidents really caught us off guard. Secondly, how blurry the safety and security line got. So again, when we started, we set an intention of clarifying the boundary between the two. And by the end, we had to admit that the distinction collapses once agents are operating with broad permissions and minimal oversight. So the same architectural decisions that can create both kinds of failures, and the same controls that you might use for security can also govern safety. So the categories can still help you understand why a system failed, but if they decide who ends up responding to the incident, you may lose time and sometimes actually misidentify the true root cause.
And third, how far ahead the deployment is compared of a governance. The capabilities of the system, the speed of new architectures, the adoption rate, and the volume of shadow AI, every one of those is outpacing both internal governance and regulations meant to help with it. Governance is still operating at maturity level designed for co-piloted deployments, while teams are shipping and running custom and multi-agentic systems. The maturity model covered in Section 8 came out of trying to put a name on that gap.
Right. So with those three observations represent some of the major findings of V2. So with that in mind, let's dive in. So this is the before and after. On the left is what V1 was working with. Plausible threats, lab environments, a reasonable argument that governance needs to catch up. On the right is what we had by the time we sat down for V2. So the thing I want you to take from this slide isn't the bullet points, it's the gap between them. So that gap closed in about 12 months. We went from this could happen to this already happened, and here's the CVE number. So that speed is itself one of the findings. So V1 was trying to make the case, and V2 assumes that the case is made and moves to what you actually do about it. So this is where the three findings come together. Most organizations are deploying agents faster than they can govern them. And more budget for programs that we already run won't necessarily close that gap. It's a different kind of a problem. So you already heard the three pieces. The threats are real now. Safety and security start to blur at the deployment layer. And the governance gap needs different tools, not just more of the same ones. So the rest of the talk walks through each one of those. I'll take finding number one, Evgeny will take number two, and we'll trade off through the third one. So the first finding, a year ago, this section would have been mostly footnotes to other people's research. As I mentioned, lab demos, controlled environments, and plausible threat models. Today, nearly every category in the top 10 for agentic AI has at least one real incident behind it. Something that broke in someone's production, or the shift really from could happen to already happened is what changed in the whole tone of the report. So, three places where you see the shift most clearly. The first is supply chain. The components agents trust have become a new attack surface. So, we'll look at light LLM in a second. The second is coding agents. Sandboxes and allow lists that worked fine for human developers turn into attack vectors when the executor is an agent. So, Cursor and Codex CLI both have CVEs that demonstrate this. Finally, we've got prompt injection. This is still architecturally unsolved at the LLM level. So the blast radius is bigger now because agents have access to tools. Excuse me. So the lethal trifecta and Meta's rule of two are the framings that have stuck to try and contend with this. One quick thing to flag. The same architectural shift is happening on user devices. Personal agents and OpenClause, the example that we cover in the report, face the same dynamics in a consumer context. There's a dedicated section on personal agents in V2 if you want to go deeper in this. While we won't dwell on it, it's striking how much of it rhymes.
Light LLM, March 2026. This is probably the clearest example we have of how trust compounds in a modern agentic supply chain. It started with something mundane, incomplete credential rotation attack on security. An attacker used it to compromise previous GitHub action through a stolen personal access token. From then, they have harvested Light LLM PyPy publishing token and pushed two backdoors versions straight to PyPy, bypassing the upstream repository entirely. The pilot abused Python's .pth mechanism to harvest over 50 categories of credential from any environment that installed it. It's gigabytes of credential being harvested. The whole supply chain took 3 hours. In that window, roughly 47,000 copies were downloaded. And Light LLM isn't a niche tool. It is the LLM gateway for CrewAI, DSPY, Microsoft GraphRack, and dozens of other popular agentic frameworks. So each of those downloads is potentially a separate breach investigation, and a blast radius follows the dependency graph. Light LM is one entry in a larger pattern. The OWASP Agentic Security Initiative maintains a living exploits and incident tracker with every documented incident mapped to the top 10 categories. If your team is building the internal case for agentic security investment, that tracker is the evidence base. The URL is on the slide, and we'd welcome your contributions. Next to the coding agents, the two CVEs that told us the same story. First, in Cursor, was in January this year. An attacker who could influence the agent instruction was able to silently poison the execution environment. And after that, commands that were already on the allow list, things like git branch or Python running and just executing arbitrary code, the allow list didn't fail to prevent the attack. It actually streamlined it because those were the commands the attacker needed. The user had already approved them. The next is Cursor CLI was even simpler. The agent's own output redefined the sandbox writable boundary. So the boundary that was supposed to contain the agent got rewritten by the agent. What stuck with us about both of these, that they are the same structural weaknesses. Sandboxes and allow lists were calibrated for human operators. They assumed the execution wouldn't influence its own containment. Once the execution was an agent that could be steered through its input, those controls didn't just stop working, they become the path the attack traveled through.
All right, so the next is prompt injection. And this is the one that everybody in the room probably already knows about. And the honest update is that it's still architecturally unsolved. The reason is fundamental. LLMs process all inputs as one token sequence. This means there's no reliable mechanism to enforce a privilege boundary between the system prompt, what the user asked, and content the agent retrieved from somewhere else. That fundamentally hasn't changed. What has changed is that agents now have tools. And so a successful injection doesn't necessarily just produce a bad output, it can trigger actions. So the field has shifted. People have largely stopped trying to prevent injection and have started to constrain what an injected agent can actually do. So two framings that came out of that shift and stuck. Simon Willison's lethal trifecta identifies the three properties that, when they're all present in the same session, give you a complete attack chain. The agent can access private data, it's exposed to untrusted content, and it can communicate externally. In October of last year, Meta published the rule of two, which turned that into a design constraint. Within any session that doesn't require human approval, an agent should satisfy no more than two of those three properties. It's a helpful way to reason about the problem. The report is careful to note that it's not a complete defense, it's more like a heuristic. So there's research showing that attacks that work even with only of those two properties present. But as a design principle for where you might be putting approval gates, it's among the clearest framings that we've seen.
And now moving to the finding two about the security and safety. So this is a new chapter in V2. And it came out of a question we kept running into while the threat analysis. When an agent causes a harm in production, which teams own it? The third version is on the slide, and our take might be contrarian at some point. So safety and security are still distinct categories, and they are still useful for understanding why a system failed. But at the deployment layer for high autonomy agents, they share enough root causes that they need to be governed together. The design decision that creates safety exposure are the same one that creates security exposure. And if category determines who responds, the risk is misdiagnosis. A team treating a memory poison event as a reliability problem might restart the agent and miss the persistence mechanism entirely. On the page, the categories are still distinct. Security asks whether a trust boundary was crossed that should have held an attacker, malicious content, or unauthorized access enabling influence that shouldn't have been possible. Safety asks whether the system could cause harm from normal operation with no adversary required. Each has a clear example from the past year. On the security side, the famous Echo leak is a zero-click exploit where a single email triggered through Microsoft Copilot into leaking confidential data, including email files and chat logs without any user interaction. On the safety side, we can say Replit in July 2025. A coding agent deleted a production database during a code freeze, fabricated records to cover it up, and claimed the rollback was impossible. And of course, it amused us during the whole Twitter conversation. No attacker was involved in the second case, and yet the damage was comparable. What stuck us writing this chapter is that both incidents trace the same root cause. The same over-permissioned access model enabled both. The same monitoring infrastructure would have caught both. The same containment across controls would have prevented both. At the deployment layer for high autonomy agents, the categories converge, not because the definitions are wrong, but because the architecture doesn't respect the distinction. And the separation worked when the worst a model could do was to produce a bad answer that a human would review before acting on it, and no harm done. That's not the world we are in anymore. In most organizations today, AI safety often sits with the ML engineering and product team, effectively the people closest to model behavior. In contrast, AI security sits with InfoSec or the CISO's office. This team content with different risk lists, escalation paths, and on-call rotations. This makes sense in a world where two problems look distinct. What V2 of the report argues is that model level safety stays with providers. These are research orgs' concerns, and they should stay there, and especially given the high cost of R&D involved. However, once the agent is acting on a production system, we argue that deployment layer safety belongs with security. That means the telemetry needs to cover both failure modes, incident response needs to be joined so teams are not debating which category fires first, while the agent is still running. An organization would benefit from adopting one set of containment control rather than two parallel ones that may or may not agree. And one cross-cutting theme before moving to the third finding is identity. Non-human identity already outnumbered humans users by roughly 100 to 1 in most enterprises. Some report says it's 500 to 1. And according to Entrust Security 2025 State of NHI report, about 97% of those carry excessive privileges. So the scale is already there, but the hygiene is not. The left side of the slide is what most organizations are working today. Static service accounts, API keys, long-lived secrets, coarse OAuth scopes, infrastructure that was built for predictable workloads that do the same every time they run. And that worked because the thing using the credential was deterministic. However, agents aren't deterministic. They decide what to do at runtime. Chain tasks, call tools, they discovered 10 seconds ago, and even the system prompt can change dynamically. So the identity layer has to change with them. Key among these requirements are a need for cryptographic attestation, so you can prove which agent did what. Credentials that are ephemeral, issues for one task and gone when it's done. Identity chaining that preserves who the human was at the start of the request and all the way through. And scopes that are built for thousands of per task decisions, not weekly batch job. This connects directly back to safety versus security finding. Credential scope is a blast radius, and the Replit incident has no attacker. But the reason that incident escalated to a production database deletion is that the agent's identity was scoped far beyond what the task required. Whether we call it a safety failure, identity failure, or security failure matters less than the fact that all these three lenses point to the same architectural problem.
Right.
Back to you.
So the third finding, our governance is already behind what we're deploying. So the fix is not to do more of what we already do. It's that we have to do maybe different work. So here's the maturity model that we constructed, and it's built around two questions. What are you deploying, and how mature is your governance? On the x-axis, you can see what it is that you're deploying. It runs from shadow AI on the left, so those are the agents that your security team doesn't know about, through vendor tools like Copilot, custom agents that you've built, all the way to multi-agent and federated systems that cross the organizational boundaries on the right. The y-axis is how well you can govern what's running. Ad hoc is at the bottom. Policy and human in the loop are at level 2. Continuous monitoring at level 3. And adaptive automated enforcement at level 4. So the green means that your governance matches your deployment. Yellow means that you're stretched. It can work, but you need to watch closely. Red means your governance can't see what those agents are doing, and so maybe you shouldn't be operating there. The pattern that kept coming up as we talked to contributors is that most organizations are further right than they expected and further down than they were comfortable admitting. Shadow AI alone puts nearly everyone at AT0 before any deliberate deployment decisions have been made, and most governance programs haven't accounted for it yet. So if you're in a red cell, you've got two options. You can either raise your governance maturity to match, or you can pull deployment back to a tier you can actually govern. We'll come back to that on the recommendation side. Regulators have already accepted the premise that agents can cause harm faster than human review can keep up. So you can see this actually reflected in the reporting clocks. So under DORA, you have 4 hours for financial services ICT incidents. You have 24 hours under NIS2 for critical infrastructure early warning, 72 hours under New York's RAISE Act for frontier AI safety incidents, and 15 days under California's SB 53. All 4 of these are enforceable with penalties attached. The problem is that quarterly governance reviews and manual triage cannot meet these timelines at agent scale. An agent that executes thousands of actions per hour needs monitoring infrastructure that operates at the same speed. That's the bottom row of the slide. Live monitoring of agent behavior, baselines that flag drift, automated incident routing, and stop mechanisms that work in seconds, not days. These are not nice to haves anymore. They're what are going to be necessary to comply with the reporting clocks. So, where do you start? The practical starting point is the same for every organization we talk to. Find the most advanced agents you're running today, and either bring your governance up to match or pull those agents back to a tier that you can actually govern. Don't operate in the red cells. But here's what makes that harder than it sounds. In nearly every organization our contributors examined, the most advanced agents weren't the ones anyone had deliberately deployed. They were shadow AI, that AT0 cell. People using AI tools that your security doesn't know about or are connected to systems that nobody has reviewed. And so you can't govern what you can't see. So discovery has to come first. So there are three things that we hope will stay with the audience after this session. First, the threats are now real. Nearly every category in the OWASP top 10 for agentic AI has at least one documented production incident behind it, and the ASI exploits an incidents tracker collects them in one place. For anyone that needs to make the case internally, that tracker is the evidence base. Secondly, safety and security start to converge at the deployment layer. Specifically, for agents operating with broad permissions and minimal oversight. The incidents we walked through today trace the same architectural root causes regardless of which label gets applied. And the team handling them needs the work, the teams handling them need to work together rather than in parallel. So for agents with limited autonomy and human-in-the-loop controls, the categories remain usefully separable. However, for high autonomy agents, they don't. Finally, the third governance gap needs different tools. The governance gap needs different tools. Life monitoring, behavioral baselines, and fast containment. Applying more rigor to the same controls that work for static systems will not close a gap that exists because the systems have changed. So the full report and the companion resources, the top 10 for agentic AI, the incidents tracker, and securing agentic apps guide are all found at genai.owasp.org.
V2 was a community effort. We had dozens of contributors across the OWASP GenAI security project, section lead, contributors, reviewers, the whole Agentic Security Initiative community. It took us several months to pull all the information together and update the report to the V2. And the depth of this report is entirely because of them.
We really appreciate your time, and we're happy to take questions. And if we don't get to all your questions, they'll definitely be sent to us for review. So if you want to get involved, the Agentic Security Initiative, ASI, is open to contributors. And the easiest way is in the OWASP GenAI Security Project Slack. So thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.